I know it's going to sound crazy, but I'm one of those people that gets really excited when science gives me good information. When science gives me new information. When science says, we used to think this and now we think that. So here we go. This is the new information that science is bringing to us today. I also have to admit that I really don't give a damn about religion. This is not making a point about, Hebrews, black Hebrews, whatever, any of that nonsense. I'm just talking about the Natufians and that culture and that they were not Europeans and they're doing all this archaeological digging, talking about what the Natufians did and it's got nothing to do with European Jews. That's my point. That's it. No more. Ibero-Mauritanians, who are not Europeans, and obviously Mauritians is going to give you Morocco and that kind of language play game. The Natufians, who are not Europeans, of course, and then Europeans and Jewish genetics. So we can put all this together and get a handle on what ancient DNA actually looked like back in the day, around the Mediterranean, near the Mediterranean, across the goddamn Mediterranean Sea, and see what really was going on. So here we go. Let's begin by talking about this article I found. And I'm going to read it, and then I have a whole lot of stuff in here for you to look at. So please take the time to do frame by frame, even as you might like listening to the sound of my voice. This kind of stuff makes me absolutely giddy. Just giddy. Humans differentiate, classify, and discriminate. Social interaction is a basic property of human Darwinian evolution. Presumably, inherent differential physical as well as behavioral properties have always been criteria for identifying friend or foe. Yet biological determinism is a relatively modern term, and scientific racism is, oddly enough, largely a consequence or a byproduct of the Age of Enlightenment and the establishment of the notion of human equality. In recent decades, ever-increasing efforts and ingenuity were invested in identifying biblical Israelitic genotypic common denominators by analyzing an assortment of phenotypes, like facial patterns, blood types, diseases, DNA sequences, and more. It becomes overwhelmingly clear that although Jews maintained detectable vertical genetic continuity along generations of socio-religious cultural relationship, also intensive horizontal genetic relationships were maintained both between Jewish communities and with the Gentile surrounding. Thus, in spite of considerable consanguinity, there is no Jewish genotype to identify. Can the Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard his spots? Then may ye also do good that are accustomed to do evil. A defining property of Darwinian evolution of humans is social interaction, and inherent differential physical as well as behavioral properties have always been the immediate criteria for identifying friend or foe. Skin color has always been an obvious physical marker for the other, and eventually a guide for socio-economic interactions, notwithstanding the socio-cultural significance that humans gave to physical properties was only one of widespread discriminating variables. Yet acceptable of the other, even tolerance was not unheard of. Karl Gärtner, 1720 to 1850, was a plant breeder in the town of Calo in southern Germany, acknowledged by Gregor Mendel in his foundational article of 1865. My postdoctoral advisor, Kurt Stern, published in 1953 in the Journal of Heredity, a note calling attention to a painting by one of Gärtner's forefathers of around 1710 on a door panel of Callow's pharmacy, the Apothecary of Paradise. It depicts the peaceful lion and the lamb, with other animals and various plants, and of course Adam and Eve. Adam is a white man, Eve is a black woman. Stern noted, it seems that the pious unknown artist of the century of rationalism, or was it his patron, had contemplated upon the existence of different races of mankind. Must not their origins go back to the stem parents? Thus the painter placed into paradise a member of each of the most strikingly different human varieties to be the progenitors of the still existing diversity. Stern and Ballard, 1953, Note 1. However, not all humans were as tolerant to skin color differences as Callow the painter. Stephen Jay Gould, in the introduction to his influential book, The Mismeasure of Man, traced biological determinism to the Platonian version of dialectics. It holds that shared behavioral norms and the social and economic differences between human groups, primarily races, classes, and sexes, arise from inherited inborn distinctions, and that society, in this sense, is an accurate reflection of biology. At Gould, 1981, page 20. As I see it, it is the inadequate distinction between genotype and phenotype that is blamed for the blunder. Biological determinism is a relatively modern term, and scientific racism is, oddly enough, to a great extent a consequence or a product of the Age of Enlightenment and the establishment of the social norms of human equality. It is in such a context that the frame of mind toward Jews must be examined. Contrary to physics and chemistry that became rational and determinist already in the 16th and 18th century respectively, it was only toward the 19th century that life scientists like Linnaeus and Buffon, Blumenbach and Lamarck adopted reductionist principles to the analysis of the apparently purpose-directed phenomena of living beings and became essentially telomechanics or telomechanistics. See Lenore, 1982, notes. Finally, toward the mid-19th century, with the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859, biologists acquired a sound and strong foundation for a rational and determinist reductive science of biology. Race, a loose term of socio-morphological classification and evaluation discrimination of living creatures, plants included, now became a formal term in the sequence of biological hierarchy of nature. But whereas species were the ultimate assemblage of the Linnaean systematics for which an empirical criterion of discrimination could be conceived, namely the possibility of producing fertile hybrids between its members, races were an added, subjective, non-biological level of classification within species, between the members of which fertile hybrids may be produced. There have been no accepted empirical criteria to differentially classify any human races or other subspecies. Thus, how can genetics help decide who is a Jew? An ongoing dispute is, are the Jews a religious community, a socio-cultural entity, an ethnic, biological classification, or what? The discordance is wide and has affected also Israeli courtrooms. The leading article of the Israeli daily Haaretz of Friday, the 4th October 2013, is deploring the defeat of Israeliship. The refusal of the Supreme Court to accept the plea of 21 citizens, most of them well-known veterans of movements of civil rights, who'd recognize them as belonging to an Israeli nation, is another expression of the failure of the civil struggle for the image of Israel. 65 years after its establishment, the authorities do not recognize an Israeli nation, disconnected of a religious definition or ethnic belonging. In their decision, the judges denied the existence of an Israeli nation and assert that it has not been proven that an Israeli nationality disconnected of a religious definition or ethnic belonging exists. 15 years earlier, in 1988, journalist Michael Shessar interviewed two Israeli Supreme Court judges asking, "Who is a Jew?" Judge Chaim Cohen responded, "The definition must be given by every single Jew for himself. If a person says of himself that he is a Jew, for me, he is a Jew. This is his autonomy, and nobody can decide for him or instead of him whether he is a Jew or not. There is no need in definitions." Retired Judge Menahem Alon emphatically contested this argument. He relied on the decision of the Knesset concerning the law of return. The definition of the concept of Jew in this context is he who was born to a Jewish mother or converted and does not belong to another religion. This is the lawful definition in the state of Israel, and in my view, this law is most essential. Otherwise, we have no Jewish nation. In a later radio interview, Justice Cohen said, "Judaism is a matter of religion for one and culture for another. I completely ignore the genes and biology. I respect the spirit that I received from my parents and from my parents' parents." In their recent book, Jews and Words, The Israeli author Amos Oz and his daughter Fania O. Salzberg insisted that it has been the Hebrew language that formed the thread which kept Jews together across the generations. Jewish continuity has always hinged on uttered and written words. Ours is not a bloodline, but a text line. How so freaking cool. Isn't that? I mean, damn. Just come right out and admit this stuff now. The author of a recent book on the myth of the Jewish race, a biologist's point of view, Alain F. Korkos and his family managed to escape in time from the jaws of the pro-Nazi anti-Semitic Vichy regime in southern France in 1944. Following a detailed analysis of the history of the Jews and Jew hatred, the author summarized, many Jewish and non-Jewish writers find it difficult to accept the idea that Judaism is simply a religion and that Jews who abandon the faith are no longer Jews. However, the ancient Jew hatred did not disappear at the Age of Enlightenment. The relative relaxation of the socio-cultural persecution against Jews was now replaced by determinist biological arguments for Jew hatred, even though the borders between the spheres were vague, as evidenced, for example, by the interchange of biological type and national identity in King James Bible, translating the Hebrew Cushite as Ethiopian. As I conceive it, tragically, it was largely the socio-cultural emancipation of the Jews that de facto instigated the biological discrimination against Jews. It must, however, be said that Jewish authors were among the first to suggest the biological distinctiveness of the Jews. See Afron, 2013. The findings support the hypothesis that posits that European Jews are comprised of Caucasus, European and Middle Eastern ancestries, and portray the European Jewish genome as a mosaic of Caucasus, European, and Semitic ancestries, thereby consolidating previous contradictory reports of Jewish ancestry. We conclude that the genome of European Jews is a tapestry of ancient populations, including Judaized Khazars, Greco-Roman Jews, Mesopotamian Jews, and Judeans, and that their population structure was formed in the Caucasus and the banks of the Volga, with roots stretching to Canaan and the banks of the Jordan, and we have come full circle. DNA in hand. These guys from science were able to analyze genetic material from the cell's nucleus in 5 people and the maternally inherited mitochondrial DNA from 7 people, but they found no genetic tie to ancient Europeans. Instead, the ancient Ibero-Maurusians appear to be related to Middle Easterners and other Africans. They shared about 2/3 of their genetic ancestry with Natufians, hunter-gatherers who lived in the Middle East 14,500 to 11,000 years ago, and 1/3 of them with sub-Saharan Africans who were most closely related to today's West Africans and the Hausa of Tanzania.